Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now I'm delighted that this week my guest is one of Britain's most popular comedians. Simon Evans has been at it now for over 20 years. He's appeared right across the media in shows such as Live at the Apollo and his own Radio 4 series Simon Evans Goes to Market. He's also been on Question Time. He's currently touring with a new show which is called The Work of the Devil, and he's with me now. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Thank you.
My pleasure.
This new show, The Work of the Devil, this is, well, it's quite a personal one, isn't it?
It's very personal, and the personal element is unfortunately something I can't talk about because I'm trying to maintain the coup de théâtre, the sort of great revelation in the final third of the show, in which I introduced the unexpected element, much as it was introduced into my life just over a year ago.
Right.
And I'm enjoying seeing a crowd react to that and fall silent with shock as the implications of what's unfolding before them sink in. It's unusual in that respect because stand-up shows are normally just a collection of routines, and to some extent you tie up a few loose ends at the end to give people the impression that you've given it a moment's thought before you started. But it doesn't generally have a sort of arc, in the way that a play does. But this one does. It has. There's a degree to which not only actually in the show itself, but and I know this is frustrating and sort of irritatingly teasing, but the nature of this sort of revelation has thrown a new light on my entire career as a stand-up. Really, yeah. It's quite. I mean, it is a personal revelation. It's about family and that sort of thing, but it's really unexpected and it's quite extraordinary. I think I'm justified in saying that. Enough people have told me that that's been their impression, that their response was.
That's quite something to do that in front of an audience, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, and it is, yes. And I wasn't at all sure how I would feel about it myself. But performing the show at the Edinburgh Festival last year, to where you do about 26 nights on the trot, one night off in the middle of that. It was actually an extraordinarily therapeutic experience. It's not something I'd done before, even sought the sort of personal, intimate, revelatory, confessional style of comedy. In fact, I think if anything, you would probably characterise me as, on the arch, ironic, detached end of the spectrum. But it's very rewarding. The only experience I previously had of it was at my own wedding, when I, you have the groom, the best man, and the father take it in turns. And because I was a comedian and I didn't want to try and get into some kind of, antler locking mentality with my best man, I said, "Listen, you do the jokes. I'm just going to deliver quite a short and emotionally raw, vote of thanks to my family and to you and to my wife's family and so on." And that was the first time I'd addressed a crowd and spoken from the heart, and acknowledged the value and the glow of love in my life, and it was an extraordinary experience. And I remember thinking afterwards, God, I wish I could find some way of incorporating that into a live show without doing it, without cheapening, without seeking cheap emotion. But 15 years passed and there were no opportunities to do so, and then suddenly out of nowhere this one arrived, and it is lovely. Really what it is, I suppose, is the final resolution amounts to an expression of gratitude, which is a great thing to do in front of people. I mean, there are, of course, large, very profitable organisations which essentially offer people the chance to stand up and express gratitude and honesty and self-revelation in front of other crowds of people and so on. If you can provide the infrastructure for doing that, I think a lot of people would regard that as a little bit Californian, for their taste. Yes, but there's no denying the power it can have. Yeah. Yes.
Do you still? I mean, you've been doing stand-up now for 23 years.
Yes, 1996. In fact, so it'll be 24 years in May.
24 years. Do you still get nervous of it?
Well, not most gigs.
Or did you get nervous?
Oh, I did get nervous. God, yes. Well, I mean, initially, I think, and I don't think I'm unusual in this respect, initially I regarded stand-up comedy as more like an extreme sport than a possible career. It was, I had no expectation of earning money out of it. I was hoping to get a journalism career started, and I did stand up because somebody asked me to write a story about it. But
so it was that simple, was it?
It was actually the Camden and St Pancras Chronicle, a local newspaper, and they asked me to write a story about some people who were teaching improv in Red Lion Square, just off Holborn, I think it is.
Yes.
And so I went along to this sort of adult education centre. It was Wednesday nights, and it was that kind of thing where everyone's in barefoot on squeaky floorboards, kind of like doing some sort of visualisation exercises. And then you start doing the improv. There are a set of conventions which enable you to interact creatively with other people, essentially just being positive, not blocking, building with their suggestion, allowing their vision of what's unfolding, in this virtual space to influence yours and so on. And it was extraordinarily addictive. I loved it. I wanted to be there all the time. I annoyed my friends by trying to introduce sort of improv games into car journeys and things. And from that, after about 2 years of that, somebody said, you can do stand-up as well. There are places where you can just try that out for fun. And again, I had no interest in making a career out of it. But again, it's just very addictive, very quickly. And I think the nerves there were a big part of that because... immediately, my first 5 minutes, which was on a night where the entire night was open spots, as they're called, just doing 5 minutes. There were no professionals in the room at all. The rest of the crowd were all people who'd come there to give moral support to an individual member. And at least half the room were there to give support to a lesbian comedian who I've lost contact with. I haven't seen her for ages. She mainly did maths comedy, but I remember there was this room. I was a little bit afraid of them because they were quite militant-looking lesbians to my mind, and in fact they were fantastic. They were the warmest and most supportive crowd of people. If they turned against me on that night, not that there was any reason why they should have done, but I don't know that I would be sitting here now. But anyway, you're in and out of the lavatory, every 5 minutes for about 3 hours beforehand, and then you come off stage and you are absolutely flying, because you've got away with it. It's like doing a skydive for the first time,
You said that you were possibly thinking of being a journalist at the time, but we were talking a little bit before we started filming, and when I've watched your stuff, it does have a rather writerly feel about it. It feels very rendered and complete, and that's relatively unusual now, isn't it?
I think it is in stand-up. I think it might always have been in stand-up. Although, having said that, some of the really classic routines, if you look at Woody Allen's routines from the early 60s, there's one about a moose which he shoots in upstate New York and then takes to a costume party. which is the most densely. I mean, it performs turns every third word. You're presented with a new scenario, and it's worth studying the transcript, almost like scripture. But then there's a lot of other stand-up that is, it's more. I mean, Billy Connolly would be one of the great giants, and he just feels like a chap who's had a couple of drinks at the bar and is just garrulous and wherever his mind takes him, But my heroes, comedically, I think, were always writers. Actually, I didn't grow up loving stand-up comedy. I didn't have any particular I like anybody else, there would be the people you would enjoy, but to be honest, most of the big stand-ups that we would watch on VHS when I was at university, for instance, were Connolly, Eddie Murphy, Steve Martin. These aren't people I've emulated at all.
So a lot of American humour then.
They seem to be like raising the temperature faster, like taking it further more quickly. There were some great I emerged when I started doing it in about 96. I think Harry Hill, Dylan Moran, I think Eddie Izzard had was like playing small theatres by then. There were some pretty creative acts, but they hadn't like turned on a light in my head in the way that, say, Douglas Adams did when I first read him, or Alan Corran for me. In the probably the first sort of adult humour that I really enjoyed were his columns, in Punch and so on.
What about? I think we're roughly the same age. What about sort of growing up? What about the people that you might have seen on TV? I mean, who did you like? I adored Les Dawson.
Dawson was great, but again, no influence on me at all. Right. I mean, he seemed of a completely. I did feel, and I still feel actually, that stand-up comedy, rightly or wrongly, but I think rightly, if I'm honest, was quite a regional. It was like an expression of your folk identity almost. Les Dawson, that's very anchored in the Northwest. It felt like it was a postcard from a particular. We didn't have mothers-in-law of that kind, it just didn't make any sense. Yeah. But my nan used to watch Coronation Street, so I understood the sort of milieu that kind of idea came out of. And then, there was Dave Allen, again, who hilariously funny, but was obviously like rooted in sectarian Irish culture, there was all of that flavour. It was folk music. I think good stand-up comedy should be rooted in place. A bit like that David Goodhart Somewhere Anywhere division. I think stand-up at its best is an expression of somewhere.
But what about these people such as Morecambe and Wise, the Two Ronnies, people like this, Victoria Wood?
Yeah.
15 million views. Okay, I know the whole technological situation's changed with it, but 15, 20, 25 million. That seems to have been that is an entirely disappeared format, isn't it? Would you call that stand-up, or were they just variety entertainers?
Interesting. Morecambe and Wise, one of the things that's well known in our business, I don't know how well known it is beyond, is that they had a live show which they would not touch for the television. Really? Yeah, and there is one recording of it. I think it was recorded at maybe Fairfield Halls in Croydon, somewhere in Croydon anyway. Which you can get on VHS, I think on eBay or whatever, which is of the live show. And I've never seen it, but so everything they did for television was purely done for television. That was nothing like Live at the Apollo. Right. Live at the Apollo, every comedian, for instance, will come on and do a set they've done countless times in the clubs, and occasionally, if they've accelerated a bit beyond their capacity to deliver, they might create some new material for the night, but it will usually show if they have, because to be honest, you want stuff that you're so comfortable in. It's like you can do it without thinking, like driving the car. Whereas, Morecambe and Wise, and as you say, Two Ronnies and so on. I mean, the famous thing with the Two Ronnies was that Ronnie Barker was writing half the material, but under an alias, so that it would be accepted on its merits. But we didn't know that at the time. We just thought they were two actors, essentially. And funny enough, I was in a hotel room 2 nights ago in Keswick, and actually, after Keswick, but I'd driven 3 hours afterwards. Anyway, it had the TV was tuned to one of those strange channels that just shows reruns from the 70s.
Oh, yes.
Either documentaries about Hitler, and then in the evening it cuts to the Two Ronnies. I don't know exactly what that market is, but it must have focused grouped very well. And anyway, so I was watching, and normally now when you see the Two Ronnies, it'll be a tribute evening, and they will cull the best and the stuff that survived, and the four candles and so on. When you see a show in the Raw now, just like uncut from 1978 or whatever, it shows its age.
Yes,
I mean, I understand the sentimental appeal and the affection on the nostalgia, but there's no getting away with it. They are extraordinarily sexist. A lot of the jokes are kind of playground humour, really. They had enormous charm and skill as performers, but I think it would be a mistake to look back through too heavily tinted spectacles at that era. I think actually comedy is probably in a healthier state now.
Really?
Yeah, I would say so. Even though they have... Yes, it was lovely that they could unite the nation, but that material would not unite the nation now, and could not. Even if the BBC were to take a deep breath and just go, do you know what? I mean, yes, Mrs. Brown's Boys is probably the closest to that, and it does win huge amounts of votes, and the rest of the industry goes, really? That's your favourite? But it's like democracy, and you have to accept it. But I can't, in my heart and in all honesty, say that I miss it. I do miss a collective culture. I do miss a sense of British identity gathered around the hearth. Yes, but if it were that it were gathered around, I don't think it would work anymore, because it's dated, and things have moved on, and not without casualties, but broadly speaking, for the better.
Wouldn't you say this is one of the reasons why, for example, sitcoms don't work really as they used to? I mean, we do have a few sitcoms, don't we? But again, you're talking about these massive sitcoms, Only Fools and Horses. I know that these are cliches, but one of the reasons they're cliches is because they're so good.
That still works, I think, and if you watch it, it stands up. Funny enough, I guess that's a little bit more recent. Is it the 90s?
It goes up to the 90s,
yeah. Interesting. I mean, those, obviously there was a baton handed over very much from Ronnie Barker to David Jason.
Yes.
I mean, they were, quite literally in open all out. My son, who is 12, adores Friday Night Dinner, which is a sitcom about a Jewish family, essentially. That's the Jewish Friday Night Dinner, set in North London, as far as I can understand it, but has sort of traditional wacky neighbours, a series of quite traditional British grotesques. And he binge watches that, like 3 or 4 in a go, and They love various American sitcoms like Modern Family and Brooklyn 99. I think the idea of a sitcom where you're just presented with the same characters in the same situation is still very much got legs. But there is an expectation now of, I think, a faster pace. I think the joke rates, they come faster. They are slightly more modulated. They did used to be a bit like set up, punch.
Yeah.
You know, and now it's more like slalom skiing. You know, there's this kind of rush. You watch Modern Family. I don't know if you've watched it. I remember the first time I watched that, I binged it on an aeroplane. And you almost feel high, you know, the speed and technical skill that's being demonstrated by just the rhythm of it. It's delirious.
But I suppose in a way as well, you're saying that, you know, even though you like the idea of, you know, a country coming together around the hearth and watching something, that wouldn't be possible now. But also it requires shared assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what pretty much has gone, would you say?
The assumptions have gone, but I think, yes,
better,
absolutely. I mean, my father still watches, he's 89, and he still watches Last of the Summer Wine, which is, again, always available on one of those channels. And I went up to see him recently. My mum was in hospital, so I was absolutely there to provide moral support for him, and I didn't question this at all, but we watched about 7 on the trot. And I was thinking, the joke is always the same, and it's this kind of, you know, there's the old fella who's got the young, slightly kind of brash, Bet Lynched style girlfriend, you know, with the blonde, you know. I mean, these are very dated caricatures, but they're not dated in my dad's head because that's how human beings are. They don't continue to move with the times at the same speed, you know.
Yes.
And to be honest, I mean, most of his memories and most of his conversation now going backwards.
Yes.
You know, he's as time goes on, he is more and more anchored in his national service days. That's where a lot of his anecdotes and so on come out of now. I think that's what happens. Families they live longer now, and people, you know, they are expanding. People live less in extended families. You know, there's all kinds of demographic changes that are going to affect how people, and of course, as you say, technology has shattered the expectation that you watch what's on. You've got 3 programs to choose from. Well, no, you haven't. You've all got a screen, and you've got the entirety of everything that's been made ever, you know, to watch. So it's extraordinary, actually, that we can still get together around certain things, but it does require a little bit of determination.
When you started doing the stand-up, you said about 96?
Yes.
Right? We were just on the cusp of having the Blair government, weren't we?
Yeah.
What was
that ruined everything for me?
Well, why? I mean, was it sort of when you went and started doing your first stand-up?
Yeah.
Maybe before you were on doing TV and radio. Was it political? I mean, or was it in the way that we understand now, or not?
My early stand-up wasn't political, no, but I think I was feeling my way for quite a long time, actually. And what I did as a stand-up, and I think a lot of stand-ups would do this, is it's almost like sonar initially. It's echolocation. You're listening for the reaction that you get. And not just in terms of a laugh, but whether the laugh is immediate and like feels like you've hit a, you know, a solar plexus, or what you want is that's the laugh you want, not that kind of but, you know, nothing polite. You've got to get a strong visceral reaction from the crowd. And when you realise, I mean, I went on, for instance, just on the most superficial level, dressed inappropriately, you know, for my material on several occasions. I thought, I'm going to go on in black jeans, black t-shirt, black leather jacket, because that's who I want to be on stage. I want to be like young Elvis, you know. And the crowd were like, What do you think you are? You look ridiculous, you know. Or at least it doesn't go with the persona. They immediately can tell that, no, you're a failed barrister. You're not, you're not you know. So then for a while I had this it was a little bit like Rob Newman in his Mary Whitehouse days. I don't know if you remember him, but he had this character called Jarvis, who was a sort of loose lounge lizard type character, slightly disreputable. picked up again in the Fast Show with a similar character who's going, me here with some Catholic schoolgirls. But anyway, it was a sort of double-breasted crushed velvet sort of smoking jacket type thing, which was, and that started to, I started to find the persona then, and gradually, and I just lucked out with this line, something along the lines of, you may be struggling to place my accent, it is in fact educated, and that was, and that always worked brilliantly well in certain, like in Newcastle, they loved that because they could immediately get it was a caricature. In London itself, of course, they were like, no, just sound a bit Australian. But anyway, gradually you build up a persona and then you start to understand yourself, but a lot of it initially is trying to understand how they are seeing you, and politics didn't really come into that at all. I did a few bits that I remember, I think probably the first time I really started to dab with politics was probably the Gulf War, and even then it was more to express bafflement and bemusement about what was going on, or what were the tactics, or what were we hoping to do, that we're invading a country because he's got weapons of mass destruction. You would think the war would be the perfect opportunity to use them, that sort of thing. And but at the same time I was working in a Radio 4 comedy show called The Way It Is. We did 8 series of that, and there I played an anchor who was roughly in the sort of Jeremy Paxman / Chris Morris mould. So we attacked political issues in that mode, but that was part of a sort of collective. But again, they knew that I was a little bit of I was a counterbalance to the rest of the team, I think, who were quite left liberal sort of leaning in that respect.
But so it was basically your persona that they assumed, that it would therefore be coming from the right. Yeah. But it was a slightly curmudgeon, is that right?
They tried to write me into different directions, but I could only really do slightly right. Well, reactionary, I suppose, is the word, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've wrestled with this, like what is conservative, what is right wing, what is blah blah blah. I think it's a kind of Peter Hitchensy sort of, well, there's nothing worth conserving anymore anyway. It's that black-pilled kind of attitude that's comic. You're not actually trying to lay out policy suggestions. That would be pointless. And the truth is, in any stand-up situation, people don't want to think very in detail about any political issues. They just want to see a kind of archetype that they can find amusing.
Do you kind of balk when people say right-wing comedian Simon Evans? I think a journalist said that to you.
I see it quite often. I mean, I do see it on Twitter occasionally. On Twitter, this will sound appalling and far worse than being right-wing, but I do occasionally name search myself just to see what people are saying about me, but behind my back, as it were. And also occasionally to find out if any venues are advertising a gig that I need to retweet, or even occasionally to find out where I'm supposed to be tonight. But occasionally you see things, and 9 times out of 10, it will be somebody has said there are no right-wing comedians, or there are no funny right-wing comedians, or there are no right-wing comedians on the television. They're either saying it in a good way or an angry way. And then somebody else will go, oh, I think Simon Evans is quite right-wing, isn't he? And then somebody else will go, I don't think he's right-wing, I just, and nobody can quite be sure. And that's how I like it. I think it's good that you don't feel... Jeremy Hardy was a left-wing comedian. He was a brilliant comedian. He could make my father, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, he could make him bark with laughter because he was a very skillful comedian. But he was unapologetically left-wing. There was no two ways about it. He made documentaries about Palestine. Whereas I don't... That's not who I want to be, But I have noticed in the last 3 years, because of Brexit, that has thrown everything into much sharper relief than it used to be. And I think that's been the point at which a lot of people have suddenly gone, well, that's odd. There don't seem to be any, not so much right-wing comedians as pro-Brexit comedians. There is Jeff Norcott, who you're probably aware of, who has quite bravely and also skillfully, has identified a path.
There's Lee Hurst too, isn't he?
Lee's he's a nice guy, Lee. I like him very much, and he's a skillful comedian, but there's no escaping the fact that his TV, he had his years on, they think it's all over, and he's he's almost retired now. I think he's been plagued with quite serious back problems, and he's not like kind of somebody who's rising to that challenge. He's just expressing his views.
You have written about this, and I think you quoted Marcus Brigstock, left-wing comedian, who basically was shocked at people walking out. Yeah. When you go outside of the M25, walking out of shows or whatever, because he was maybe rude about Brexiteers, I think you said it's almost like a poison that had been injected into comedy.
Yes.
Was that be
I
right?
wouldn't say it was necessarily a poison. There was a moment when I think it was suddenly exposed that such an overwhelming majority of comedians had just presumed a consensus about Europe that wasn't shared outside of their bubble. I mean, that's a slightly sort of scabrous term, but yeah. And I think they were going into the Shires with that presumed consensus and discovering that it wasn't there. Having said that, also with all these things, it's always in layers, because to some extent comedians will sort of talk about this sort of thing in order to get some sort of traction with the press anyway. So you can never be sure how serious it is. Marcus is a skilled comedian. I'm sure he can turn a room around or acknowledge what's going on or step back a bit there. I have seen some comedians, I won't name names, who made me feel uncomfortable on behalf of anyone in the audience who was pro-Brexit. And I don't think that's right, personally. I mean, I just think that's wrong. I don't think you should make anyone feel uncomfortable in the audience for being black or for being gay or any... And you know, you might say, well, those are immutable characteristics and Brexit is a political opinion. Well, it is, but it's not like being a Nazi, and they're sort of suggesting it is, you know. But I don't think that was very common. But there was certainly... I think everyone was brought up short by a sudden realisation that the comedy community had sort of drifted into this quite narrowly confined space, which was quite surprising.
I think it's not just comedies. I mean, in the sense that there was a report out recently. My background is in the arts, you know, TV producing and writing about them.
Right.
But there was a report out recently, last week, which talked about the fact that not only are the arts generally, the creative sphere, monolithically on the same page about almost everything, not just Brexit, but they actually have really started, you know, to in some ways penalise people who have different views. Now that is a situation that seems very recognisable to me, I have to say. I mean, so it's not just comedy, and you know, it's theatre, it's all of these areas, I would have thought. And when I watch or listen to the BBC, it does appear to me, I know it's a cliche, that it's just endless, just left-wing comedy.
Well, I think, I mean, I have to be careful what I say about the BBC, because I hope to continue a career with them, but I do sometimes think they do seem to have almost a death wish at the precisely the moment at which they are struggling to demonstrate the legitimacy of the licence fee. I can't see how they can claim there is anything other than an absurd level of bias. The news, I think, is pretty good. I think news and current affairs, there are definitely some right-wing journalists, and you can identify them, and there are some left-wing journalists, and they get some stories wrong, but they seem to attract fire from both sides, at least. You know. I do think the comedy and drama departments, I don't watch a huge amount of it, you know, but it is extraordinary how often you will hear somebody complaining that they can no longer watch such and such a show because it's become very woke. This is usually the adjective that describes not just left wing, but sort of sanctimoniously preachy. You know, yes, I do think there is a danger of that. Whether it's a long term thing, I don't know. Whether it's something that is. I think it's quite interesting. I mean, even yesterday, I don't know if you saw this on Twitter, the Royal Institute, a scientific body, put out a tweet in which they were trying to understand why women weren't engaging with their video content as much as men were. Something like a ratio of 7-1 they had discovered on their YouTube videos and so on. And they put out this tweet saying, if you identify as a woman, we'd like to hear from you about you know, and immediately attracted a lot of people on Twitter saying, what do you mean identify as a woman? If you're trying to ask women, just ask women. Now, you know, I think it's interesting, although I felt irritated, I think what you can see there is, you know, there's a lot of people in the role of social media, operative for these organisations who are desperately trying to work out how to navigate and steer their way through very turbulent waters in this regard, you know, and maybe things will settle down quite soon. I don't know, but this is, I think, what's happening as much as anything else. You know,
I think the problem is this really is when it comes to, say, your area, comedy and the BBC, is that, you know, there's this thing is in comedies there of punching down and punching up. You know, you should, if anything, you should try and punch up, you know, and go for the establishment. But increasingly, one feels that actually the punching is downwards. It's towards these awful people who voted Brexit, and by extension Conservative people, and you're watching it. I watch it, and I used to enjoy the new. Have I got news for you? I used to enjoy it, but now I sort of look at it and I sort of think you would disapprove of me. Why, therefore, can I laugh at you?
Yes, well, I understand that feeling. I don't know that they would. I think Paul Merton is pretty good, actually, in terms of maintaining balance, and obviously it does depend who hosts it. But without looking at that particular programme, I do agree with you that the punching down, punching up thing is not as straightforward as it sounds. I mentioned that on that Radio 4 show that I did last year, Simon Evans Is Right, which you can still hear on the Sounds app, which is... it is deceptive because, the in-group, out-group thing, it's a genuine dynamic, but it isn't always immediately apparent who's got the upper hand in any given situation.
Yeah.
And what can amount to the establishment doesn't necessarily mean in the old terms of who owns the property and who has the ear of the Queen. It can be, as you say, within the media group, it can be the people who have the correct opinions, the high-status opinions, who can demonstrate that they can afford to be like pro-refugee or whatever. And then of course if you're anti-refugee, then to take an extreme example, if you are sceptical about open borders, then if you can, both sides can say, well, you're punching down, because one side will say, well, you're making jokes that are about the refugees are the most marginalised and vulnerable people in the world. But on the other hand, the jokes that are at the expense of somebody who would rather maintain border controls, those people, as you say, don't necessarily feel they have any power. Which is why I always say every good comedy routine should be more like a boxing match. You should punch up, down, sideways, and you should land a few blows on yourself as well. This is what people want to see. They want to see a flurry of punches, not just this relentless, bomb, bomb, bomb on the same target.
Do you find, though, that audiences come to see certain comedians, because they want things confirmed in their mind? I mean, there is this sense...
sorry to interrupt, but I think everyone wants that. I do think it's one of the great illusions of stand-up comedy that many of us cherish, is that you can change minds, or that people like to make you think. They don't like to be made to think. I mean, almost nobody likes to be made to think. Afterwards, you might kind of go, that was interesting, I found that funny, but on reflection, I suppose what he was saying there was actually, that might happen a little bit, but thinking and laughing are anathema. You have to circumvent, you have to bypass the part of the brain that reflects and ponders and untangles. You have to make people laugh like that, otherwise it's dead.
One thing I'm sure that is the case now that wouldn't have been the case in 1996 when you started doing stand-up is this extraordinary culture now we have of the giving or taking of offence. I mean, this has huge implications, surely, for comedy, doesn't it? In fact, sometimes it appears to be only about comedy.
Yes.
What people say in comedy. I mean, has this affected the way that you do your stand-up?
The trick, and the really tricky thing about it is, it's annoying if you feel that you can't just crack a joke and somebody might go, well, it's a bit, or phobic or whatever. But on the other hand, I think even worse is trying to create comedy. I mean, there's one person who gets away with it, which is Ricky Gervais, probably, who's created his whole brand now as a stand-up. And even that is only really works because he's already created such good television, with his sitcoms and so on, that he has the authority. But where you can kind of go, I don't care, I'm going to say offensive things. You see, I don't, you know what I mean, at the Golden Globes or whatever. And everyone laughs and loves that. But that can be really irritating as well, I've always thought the thing with all good stand-up comedy throughout the ages has been you find out where the edge is in the room you're playing, and then you like hop back and forth across it. You're a little bit, whoop, a little bit. But, and so technically and in theory, it shouldn't matter what people find offensive, whether you live in an era where you can use the N-word half a dozen times in your set, nobody will care, or whether you live in an era in which you so much as suggest that a husband and wife may not have biologically indistinct preferences is horrifically beyond the pale. As long as you know where the border is, you can go back and forth it. But, of course, what is problematic now, I think, in audiences is not people taking offence themselves or feeling offended genuinely, it's people projecting and second-guessing what other people might feel on their behalf.
Exactly.
And that becomes impossible. That if too much of that goes on, It doesn't happen very often. I think the only occasion I've had it probably in my own stand-up has been in corporate environments. Corporate events are more difficult. I like to think I'm pretty good at them, and I think other comedians, would acknowledge that this is one of the reasons they're tough, is because the person who's booked you is terribly worried that you might offend this client or that department, or they want to make it more inclusive or not inclusive, in various ways, and they have the corporate culture which they might be offended or anxious on behalf of, as well as the people who are actually in the room. But
there was this case recently, wasn't there, with the comedian, I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but it really put the noses out of joint of this corporate bash he was doing. Is it Anish Kapoor?
Anish Kumar. Well, that wasn't a corporate. I was at that event. That was the Lord's Taverners. That was a charity lunch.
Right.
There were, people were there in connection with their work. They booked tables or whatever, but it wasn't a company do. Yeah, the Lord's Taverners lunch. That was at the Grosvenor Hotel. It's the biggest corporate room in the country. It's about 1,200 seater, and. I was on the front row for that. It was quite interesting. He came on and did at least 5, maybe 10 minutes to really supportive laughter and applause, and again, quite self-deprecating about his own ethnic background and immigrant experience and what have you. And then he decided quite deliberately to start doing stuff about how much of a racist Boris Johnson was and how bad Brexit was. And there was a bit of, oh no, not this again, rather than kind of, no, get off. It was more like, oh no, really? And then somebody threw a roll, but in a kind of quite light-hearted way. But then the whole thing did just sort of deteriorate, I think quite unexpectedly, really. I'd not seen that there before. But, I'm not going to tell Nish what he has to do. Whoever booked him must have known that's the kind of comedian he is. You can't book Nish Kumar and expect him to come on and do... a Dave Allen routine. This is the thing. Being a booker for a big corporate event, they earn a lot of money. They quite often will take the comedian's fee and double it, and have half of that. So you have to earn your keep, but not for that one. I think that was probably because it's a charity event. Probably somebody said, "Oh, this will do it for you," and they didn't perhaps look into it quite as deeply as they should. But again, is that just that thing of consensus, really? Just assuming that everyone's on the same page, and maybe they're not. I
remember seeing Joan Rivers doing a stand-up towards the end of her life, actually. Yeah. And she was one of my favourites.
Yeah, it's great.
And she basically someone did stand up and she was making a joke about deaf people, and he said, "My son's deaf," and everything, and she went for this guy. She said, "Don't you start telling me, don't you start." She swore at him and everything, and she got the audience on side.
Yeah,
actually,
if you have enough confidence,
and she brazened it out.
A, confidence in the moment, and also a huge hinterland. 50 years of being an abrasively offensive comic. You can't go to her gig and then go, "How dare you? My son has this rare neurological disorder." They know what they're getting. And there are a lot of people. Frankie Boyle, who has pushed the envelope, on offence quite a lot, had people in the front row. He would do material about this, that, or the other marginalised group, vulnerable people, immutable characteristics, and they're laughing their heads off, and then he will say the one thing about the one thing they have a family, and they're like, "Oh no, you can't." Do what? It was absurd hypocrisy.
I think does seem to be a very problematic thing now, which comedy is on the absolute knife edge of, and that, as I say, and that is in the whole identity area in the woke which you've referred to. But you say that comedy's in a healthier place now. I think it's in. A lot of comedy is working in very, the coalface of identity politics and all that kind of stuff. It's still trying to work out how to deal with that. But I do think if you look at, for instance, the strong American sitcoms, and people like Tina Fey, 30 Rock. That's not brand new. Parks and Recreation, those kind of shows. They are faster, more sophisticated, more multi-layered. They're more satisfying, They're more intelligent, to be honest, than a lot of the sitcoms that we have a kind of unexamined nostalgia for in Britain. And I think the most woke kind of stuff is
it is a little bit crazy, and there is a sense at the moment, not just comedy, I mean, like the Labour Party look quite realistically like making themselves completely unelectable over an issue which affects much less than 1% of the population in truth. So it's, there is a certain kind of insanity at large, in the world, and it is for comedy to address that. But I wouldn't want to say that it was a serious problem affecting comedy at the moment. It's just an aspect of comedy that you can become fixated upon if you want to see, funnily enough, from almost the exactly opposite direction to what I assume we share as a political view, was Nick Cohen yesterday in is it Standpoint magazine, complaining that right-wing satirists were failing to take advantage of the lunacy on the left at the moment.
I think he's right.
He's right that they're not great at doing it, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the job of the right-wing satirist to attack the left. Actually, that can be done by the left, who are trying to make the left electable again. I mean, you could definitely make that case.
Yes, you could. But
the ruling classes were satirised brutally in the 1960s, a real sea change in society by the ruling classes. People like Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller were coming from that stock. They understood the weakness and the hypocrisy and the preposterous absurdity of trying to maintain an aristocracy in that day and age, and that's why they were so great at satirising it.
They were great, but the big point really is that the establishment now is left-wing. There's no question about it.
No.
The progressive ideology goes through all of it.
Well, certainly
so
the
why aren't people making jokes? I mean,
yeah.
If you look at Take Spitting Image, I know it's not stand-up, but Take Spitting Image, one of these, basically. You could have a go at the royal family. You'd have a go at, particularly, politicians or whatever. You look at it now. I think they tried to revive something like it a while ago. And it didn't, because basically people are too frightened to take on certain things anymore.
And there's even The Simpsons now. There was a hideous thing which was shared on Twitter about a year ago. I don't know if you remember when Donald Trump. He made some arguably quite unacceptable remark to the effect that Ilhan Omar should go back to Somalia and sort that place out before she started shouting about American politics being broken. And of course, this created there was a British BBC presenter, BBC Breakfast presenter, I think, who was accused of being who was accused of being out of order because she said it was racist and so on. But The Simpsons satirised it by having Donald Trump being chased through the White House by these three women of colour, of whom Ilhan Omar was one. I can't remember the other two were, and it was so one-sided, and it was so and it was done as a sort of song, it was just, that was really icky to the point where you just go, oh my God, you've actually made me, I'm now sympathising with Trump here, because this is so, so woke. But then you look at South Park. I don't know if you watch South Park, that'd be an American animated show, and that has probably been the single most deft, fearless, and just witty and funny and bravura, display of scepticism about social justice politics for the last 10, 15 years, ahead of many of us in this country even realising what was going on. But you're right, it has become, they are the establishment in terms of the media, whether it was a genuine long march through the institutions, or whether it has just naturally occurred, whether it's an emergent phenomenon, or whether there has been some sort of determined effort to sort of penetrate and work from the inside. There has definitely been a twist, and the shape has changed, and there are an awful lot of people now working in the sort of commissioning process who share a collective view which is not shared by the wider public. That is true. And then they do, I think, to some extent, throw them a bone in the shape of Mrs. Brown's Boys or whatever occasionally, rather than say, we want to see really intelligent, scabrous, vicious satire from the right, or of the South Park variety or whatever, that takes no prisoners and regards everyone as fair game. We want to see that. We will commission that. A lot of people will say, well, if you want to see that kind of comedy, why don't you write it? Why don't you do it? But there is definitely, the reality is that if you don't feel it's likely to get picked up, if there's no door open for that, if there's no port willing to accept your cargo, then it kind of is a suppressive effect. As has been understood by television, because for 15 years ago, every year you would go to the Edinburgh Festival, every newspaper would be carrying a story saying, why are there no female comedians? Why are there no women comedians? Are women not funny? And it was genuinely discussed, on that kind of, is there some neurological reason or cultural reason why there are no... And a decision was made, or a series of decisions were made in the BBC and elsewhere, that they were going to start putting women onto panel games like Mock the Week and so on, regardless of the fact that there were probably no more than maybe a ratio of 10 to 1 male to female comedians in the country as a whole, in the live circuit. Maybe not even that many female comedians when I started. But they said, we are going to put some on because that will create a momentum in the direction we want to see the industry go. We want to see more female comedians, and so we start putting them on. And so if you were a half decent female comedian 10 years ago, certainly you suddenly had a pretty good chance of getting onto these shows because you were in short supply. And that did create a greater impetus to become for female comedians to be drawn into it and to have the confidence that there was a place for them and that it wasn't just a thing that blokes did. And now I would say it's a fairly even split. And if you go to a comedy evening in a comedy club in provincial Britain, chances are there'll be at least one, possibly 50-50, whereas before it would be really quite unusual. It was almost a bit of a, oh, here we go.
Yes. I think I remember a while ago, similarly, Nicholas Heitner, National Theatre, then director of National Theatre, said, what we need some good, I remember his words, sort of like naughty right-wing plays. The sort of the implication being that, come on, let them have a few. Let them have a few. But what emerged then is exactly what you've just said, which is that it becomes this vicious circle. People don't put things forward. They say, well, we just don't have any right-wing people putting stuff forward. They don't, because they think they're not going to be
And also they haven't seen, we all need templates. Nobody creates work, well, a handful of people create work in a vacuum. And very often, I mean, you look at something like the Beatles, extraordinary creativity. If you look more closely, it's because they were influenced by Bernard Cribbins and Spike Milligan rather than just by Jerry Lee Lewis. Sometimes you just need to have different. So if you're a left-wing playwright, you can basically rewrite something that or three or four. You can rewrite some Brecht. You bring in a bit of Tom Stoppard. Actually, to be fair, he's probably quite right-wing, but you can bring in
one of the few.
Yeah, exactly. Some Lodge or whatever. Out of my depth already, but the fact is, art advances incrementally. I think Elvis Costello said something that I always thought was brilliant, which I heard early on. He said, there are very few people who are deliberately creative and create anything new. Most people start out in the arts trying to copy their heroes and getting it slightly wrong. That's actually how the arts moves forward. Most of us in the punk thing were just trying to get back to the rawness of rock and roll. We weren't trying to create anything new. We just wanted to get back to the excitement of, and that's how plays and that's how comedians operate. Most comedians will go on channeling somebody else to some extent initially until you find your own voice. You've just got to be able to see that there is somebody else that you can go, I'd be like that.
Do you think, Simon, that comedy is an art? And if so, do you think of yourself as an artist? I mean, the reason I used to write for Culture, Sunday Times Culture a lot, and they were very big on comedy. Indeed, comedy now is reviewed in, if you like, the arts pages. Yeah, it's considered to be one of the arts. I mean, you don't see it as an art.
Well, these are slippery words, aren't they? But I think it's part of culture, definitely. I think any definition of culture includes it. But then, who was it listening to? Was it Stephen Pinker or somebody talking about the difference between culture with a capital C and culture with a small c? I suppose there's always that kind of, is it just everything that everyone does all the time?
No, I think very specifically they're talking about it being an art form.
With a big C, yeah. I think the Sunday Times Culture, somebody told me, was partly inspired by, was it the Modern Review,
yes,
Toby Young and all that, and that idea of raising up, the writing for Coronation Street and so on. Well, the degree to which I reject the idea that it's art, and I think it can be elevated to the level of art, but there's something actually I like the fact that it isn't really an art. I think it's more like a folk art. I think it's a folk tradition. I think it's at its best when and its best practitioners are kind of drawing and channeling the kind of psyche of the people, of their people. It doesn't have to be of their region, it can be some other organising principle, but they're not. I don't feel it's like Michelangelo, you know what I mean, or Van Gogh. I think it's more like, I mean, Billy Connolly really is the kind of motherlode of British stand-up comedy, really, you know, and then you have the sort of Jewish tradition from the New York resorts or whatever. But, you know, it's like the bit of banter between songs, really, you know. I think most comedians feel more comfortable when they're not being held to that kind of standard. And if you get to the point where you deliver a routine that's so perfectly worded, the timing and everything is so great, you find yourself thinking, that's bloody art, that is. Well, that's great, because that's a moment, just like seeing a batsman play such a glorious you know, cover drive, that you just go, oh, that's art, you know. But it's the very fact that you've registered that it's been elevated for that moment, you know. It's not, the whole thing isn't art really, any more than cricket is art for the whole 5 days. It's like there are moments where it elevates to that level, and that's fine. But really, it's a craft and it's a folk active. I don't know. I want to say a folk art, but that means like you know what I mean?
Yes.
You know, almost like cave painting or something. It can be every bit as worthwhile. It's not to diminish it. It just doesn't feel like it's the state of mind that you would try and enter in order to create art.
You're touring at the moment. Where are you going to be next? Where can people come and see you and maybe see a few moments of
a few moments where it elevates? I shall be elevating in Devon in the first week of March, and I think then the Midlands in the second week of March, Nottingham and Birmingham, I think, and one or two others. All on my website, if you want to have a look. It's The Simon Evans. That's my website, .com. And I have a gigs page on there. It's been knocked up for me very recently as a brand new, nice, shiny website that I'm very pleased with. Well,
Simon, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. You know, thank you very much, and congratulations as well on the tour.
Thank you.
There you go. So it's thesimonevans.com if you want to come and see this man. And thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time. Please remember to subscribe, won't you? Thank you. Bye.